Let's talk about the Miami Hurricanes for a minute. I came across a newspaper article a few weeks ago. It was published in June, and it just made me laugh. As yet another personality publication, university itself calls for Miami to drop football and athletics. A guy named Robert F. Sanchez wrote this opinion piece for the Miami Herald. He's a former member of the Herald's editorial board, and he apparently still writes a newsletter for them, an email newsletter. So Sanchez says, I quote, a dubious new line of business operating teams in professional sports leagues. Sanchez was triggered by the House versus NCAA settlement. That settlement is going to lead to universities revenue sharing directly with athletes. Prominent universities are probably going to set aside as much as $20 million a year based on the initial settlement numbers to pay their athletes to compete for the university. In addition to the $20 million a year, which Sanchez says is too much for the university because the university is stuck in the ACC and nobody seems to want Miami outside the ACC. Sanchez believes the ACC is going to fall so far behind in revenues that it's going to end up putting a strain on a school like Miami to raise that $20 million elsewhere to stay in competition. He's not totally wrong about the ACC, but we're not exactly sure where the ACC or realignment is going to end up. So that's really speculation on his part. The other issue he brings up, which is legitimate, but it's going to be an issue everywhere, are the legal issues with having athletes as direct employees of the schools. There are federal laws, state laws, and all sorts of restrictions and unions and complicated things that can make that a thorny process. I think there's going to be a workaround for that. Athletes not employed directly by the schools, but employed by the conferences. But again, we'll see how that shakes out, and that's speculation by Sanchez. So he's planting an early seed, but he's not exactly sure where he's going with it. One of his primary points is that Miami has already accomplished all it's going to with its athletic programs. For decades, it was known as Suntan U. It did not attract serious professors. It did not attract serious academics or students, and it had a paltry reputation amongst American universities. Miami has reversed that completely. It's a fairly prestigious private university now. It attracts high-end students, high-end faculty. It's been invited to the AAU, Association of American Universities, and his point is Miami can now cradle that academic reputation and allow it to grow to unprecedented heights is apparently his vision. He cites the University of Chicago as a benchmark and something for Miami to aspire towards. I find that a spurious comparison, and I often find it spurious because I think many people are ignorant of what happened at the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago was a founding member of the Big Ten, 1895-1896. Amos Alonzo Stagg was its football coach. It very consciously used football to build its university. John D. Rockefeller was the founder of the University of Chicago. He bankrolled it in the early days, donated a lot of money to the school. But in 1939, Chicago dropped football, the only major university ever to drop football, and eventually dropped out of the Big Ten entirely. They later reconstitute as a Division III athletic school and bring athletics back decades later, football back decades later. That wasn't a good experience for Chicago. The president who did that, Robert Maynard Hutchins was his name, took advantage of a situation at the university in which the football program had been diminished within over the course of decades. Faculty and administrators were sick of Stagg. They reorganized the academic curriculum. They made it extremely difficult to attract players. The school fell off and eventually started taking dangerous butt kickings from other Big Ten schools. In its final season, they got beaten back-to-back weeks, 85-0 by Michigan and Ohio State or another. I can't remember who the other school was. But they lost back-to-back games 85-0. And Hutchins took advantage of this and said, we just got to drop this football program because we're not going to allow academically subpar students in, and we're not going to drop to compete at a lower level. Hutchins, ironically, thought that was beneath the University of Chicago. It was big time or bust, and he thought the big time was too corrupt. When Hutchins retired several decades later, Chicago was at a historic low for the university. They had lost their lead as an endowment leader. People were no longer donating to the school. They offered multiple degrees that were not recognized by any bachelor school or graduate school. So you could take a bachelor's degree from Chicago and not be allowed to matriculate to another university because they didn't recognize your degree. Hutchins was a dreamy guy. He took the school in a dreamy direction, and it was really after him that once again Chicago began to rebuild to the now globally elite institution that it is. But dropping football had nothing to do with that rise to the top for Chicago. And in fact, Hutchins left the school probably in several ways in worse place than he found it. So it's a spurious comparison. And I think it just comes from a guy like Sanchez from ignorance. You hear the story, Chicago dropped football. Now Chicago's academically elite. But the two aren't connected in the way people think they are. So Sanchez goes on to say that because Miami doesn't have an on-campus football stadium, they only have a basketball arena and then football practice facilities, that it would essentially be easy to drop the sport. They wouldn't lose a big physical plant investment, and that Miami could just move on. And the students would continue to come because of the school that Miami now is. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I'm not sure why he wants that or not. But the thing that made me scoff is this is like the fourth time that this has happened to Miami. And Miami's fan base takes its knocks, but Miami has a dedicated, hardcore fan base that really loves that football program. And I do think it would hurt the university to lose them. So, in the late 70s, the university itself said it was going to drop football. 1994, Sports Illustrated, really at probably the peak of SI's power culturally, or if not the peak, it was a powerful institution. Put Miami on the cover. Alexander Wolf, one of their main writers, wrote a story, and he called on Miami to drop football, and he cited the football scandals of the 80s and 90s, which some were small and overblown, but some were extremely serious. Miami did not drop the program. They brought in Butch Davis. They rebuilt the program in a much cleaner fashion than it had been. Returned to glory, had a 3-year run where they could have won 3 consecutive national titles. They won 1 in the middle, were robbed of a chance at the beginning, and then lost in the title game in the final year, and then sort of reverted back to the middling school that Miami had been in the 50s and 60s. And then in 2011, of course, the Nevin Shapiro scandal hit. Shapiro, a Ponzi schemer, had committed a Bible's worth, James Joyce's Ulysses worth volume of infractions at Miami. He was in federal prison. He spilled his guts. And it was ugly once again for Miami, particularly because they hadn't been winning like the old days. Though Shapiro was involved in the glory days at the beginning of the century. But again, there were calls, does Miami need to be playing football? Can Miami do this the right way, etc.? And now here we are in 2024 with the House settlement, and another Miami Herald contributor, newsletter writer is saying, should Miami just get rid of sports? It's crazy to me to have this happen so frequently at the University of Miami, and I think it would be a bad idea. Miami's building a monster new practice facility. It's been delayed, but they say it's going to be built. They've built out their current indoor facility, and they're souping up their weight room. So they're going to have, top tier standard weight room. There still is an opportunity for them to build back. They have Mario Cristobal. They paid him a big salary to bring back the old attitude without the scandals at Miami. We'll see if he can do that. He's certainly a great recruiter and a great fundraiser. Miami is looking at stadium locations. I don't know if they're going to be able to do anything. Right now they play in the Dolphin Stadium. It's obviously a terrible atmosphere. But losing Miami, I think, in Florida, the big three, Florida State, Florida, Miami, I think it would be a huge loss to the sport. And I don't think it's a good idea at all. And I don't think Sanchez is going to get a lot of traction with this. But what do you guys think? Why does this happen to Miami? Should Miami consider dropping football and athletics? And what does Miami need to do going forward? Let me know in the comments and tell me what you think. All right, guys, we'll talk soon. Thanks for the time. Peace.